Universidad de los Andes. Es un gusto verles y tenerles acá. También a las personas que nos están viendo en línea les damos la más cordial bienvenida. Mi nombre es Jimena Hurtado, yo soy profesora de la Facultad de Economía de esta universidad y en este momento estamos con visitantes ilustres y por eso estamos aprovechando esta ocasión por la conferencia de la International Adam Smith Society que estamos hospedando esta vez en la facultad. Además, gracias al apoyo del programa de la Universidad de los Andes, Pensadores del Mundo, tenemos el gusto de contar con nosotros al profesor Tyler Cowen y que vamos a presentar en contados instantes. Antes de eso, yo quisiera también agradecer a quienes nos han permitido realizar este evento. La conferencia ha contado con el apoyo definitivo para la buena realización del Centro de Estudios Públicos de Chile, de la Jepson School of Leadership Studies de la Universidad de Richmond, del programa Adam Smith Works de Liberty Fund y de Trinity University. A ellos mil gracias por el apoyo. A quienes nos acompañan y han venido de lugares diferentes del mundo también les agradecemos enormemente. La International Adam Smith Society es una sociedad que ya lleva algunos años funcionando y manteniendo a Adam Smith vivito y coleando y trayéndolo a la realidad y a las discusiones interesantes que podemos tener gracias a este pensador escocés. Y quisiera también aprovechar para invitarles a hacerse integrantes, miembros de la sociedad. Si ustedes van y buscan International Adam Smith Society, la van a encontrar y van a encontrar una cantidad de información interesante, entre otras cosas, la revista de la sociedad que se llama The Adam Smith Review, y si son miembros, además van a poder tener un acceso preferencial a la revista. Entonces aprovecho para hacer estos anuncios también. Y para invitarles, si se hacen miembros, las próximas conferencias de la sociedad serán el próximo año 2023, que es un año muy importante en términos de Adam Smith precisamente, que será en St. Andrews, en Escocia, del 18 al 21 de julio. Y la siguiente va a ser en Tokio, en Japón, del 11 al 13 de marzo del 2024. Entonces esperamos verlos a todos ahora que hacemos conferencias híbridas, bien sea en línea o en persona, preferiblemente en persona. Pero de nuevo quisiera entonces agradecer en especial al programa de Pensadores del Mundo de la Universidad de los Andes, que nos ha permitido tener con nosotros al profesor Cowen. Es un gran honor tenerlo aquí con nosotros y en este momento voy a pasar la palabra a la profesora María Pía Paganelli, quien es profesora de la Universidad de Trinity. Seguramente es una de las personas que más sabe, más ha escrito, más avanzado en los últimos años sobre Adam Smith. Es fácil de encontrar, pueden googlearla y encontrarán todo lo que ha escrito al respecto. Y en este momento nos acompaña sobre todo como presidenta de la sociedad y le doy la palabra también porque ya hicieron la cuenta, pero no les voy a contar, muchos años de colaboración con Tyler Cowen y me parece que es la mejor persona para presentar a nuestro invitado. Muchas gracias a todos por estar aquí. María Pía.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here or actually accepting the International Adam Smith Society invitation to host a conference here. So thank you very, very much, Jimena, for organizing such a wonderful event. Thanks to the Universidad de los Andes for hosting us here. It's really been a great pleasure and a great honor to be in Colombia. And I'm extremely honored and excited to be presenting Tyler Cowen as our keynote speaker. Tyler Cowen is the Holbert Harris Chair of Economics at George Mason University, the Distinguished Senior Fellow in the Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, and the Chairman and Director of the Mercatus Center. Cowen is a co-author of a popular economic blog called The Marginal Revolution, and co-founder of the online educational platform Marginal Revolution University. He has a podcast called Conversation with Tyler, and also runs a philanthropic fund called Emergent Ventures. A dedicated writer and communicator, Tyler Cowen is the author of several best-selling books and widely published in academic journals and popular media. He writes a column for Bloomberg Views, has contributed extensively to the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Money, serves on the advisory board of both Wilson Quarterly and American Interest, and his research has been published in the American Economic Review, the Journal of Political Economy, Ethics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs. Bloomberg Businessweek profiled Tyler Cowen as the American hottest economist in 2011. One of his books, The Great Stagnation, appeared twice on the New York Times ebook bestseller list. Foreign Policy named Cowen as one of the top 100 global thinkers. And the Economist survey, an Economist survey counted him as one of the most influential economists of the last decade. Tyler Cowen is a graduate from George Mason University with a BS in economics and received his PhD in economics from Harvard University. It's an immense honor to be able to introduce him as our speaker. So welcome, Tyler.
Thank you, Maria, for the very kind introduction. Thank you all for being here. I have two ideas in my mind today. One of them is Adam Smith, and the other is Colombia. So I've been trying to think, how do these two ideas relate to each other? I'm going to start very small with some details about Adam Smith's ideas, but then get very large and give you my views on Adam Smith as a whole. So I was thinking, which parts of Adam Smith's greatest book, Wealth of Nations, apply most directly to Colombia? And of course, the answer is the best part of the book. And for me, the best part of Wealth of Nations is Book 5. It has the misleadingly narrow title of The Revenue of the Sovereign or Commonwealth, which sounds very boring, but to me it's the most exciting part of the book. It's about conflict. It's about whether nations survive or not. It's about education. It's about what kind of ideas will flourish in a nation, and which nations in turn will flourish based on the ideas in them. So, Adam Smith is best known as an economist and for his views on capitalism. All that is quite important. But I read him as also being a military theorist. And there are parts of Wealth of Nations that suggest that conflict and war are more important than the economy. Smith himself says that the art of war is the noblest of all arts. And I think he is not saying that lightly. If you consider Smith's view on the Navigation Acts, 1660, they were very mercantilist. People were shocked to see that Adam Smith actually endorses the Navigation Acts of that time. And what did Smith say? Smith said that defense is more important than opulence, and that Great Britain needed to have its own ships to defend itself, that the Navigation Acts would help Great Britain have its own ships, and that if national defense were at stake, Smith was really quite willing to just be a kind of mercantilist. I'm struck also by the very title of the book. It is called Wealth of Nations. He could have called it Wealth of Individuals, right? It's too many syllables. It's a bad title. Like Wealth of Nations is much better. But there is some way in which Smith is a very sophisticated continuation of earlier mercantilist thought. So he's not a free market economist. I would say he's a market economist who is asking what are the prerequisites for having a successful capitalist decentralized system. And that will involve some amount of government activity, whether we like that or not. And the most important of those activities had to do with war. Now, if you doubt that Smith is concerned with this big picture, keep in mind, as Maria Pia periodically reminds me, that Smith, before he died, had these grand plans for a multi-volume work on law and nations and politics and big theory of history. He burned the work he had done because he was not satisfied with it. But Smith saw his own ideas, his own career, as leading into these very big picture ideas. Now, I was thinking, to go back to Colombia, we can't just talk about Adam Smith, right? We're in Bogota. Like, what's the sentence or what's the part in the Wealth of Nations where you think the most about Colombia? So this I was pondering, and I have a nomination. And this is Adam Smith's argument for a standing army. I'm going to come back to the meaning of the standing army dispute. But in my admittedly bizarre reading of Adam Smith, his defense of a standing army was in a way his most progressive view, his most modernist view, his strangest and most radical view. It doesn't sound strange to us today because most countries have standing armies, right? Doesn't sound unusual. But for Smith, the standing army was very important. The critics of a standing army argued it would lead to despotism. They cited the history of Julius Caesar. They argued it would centralize too much power in the government. It would be prone to abuse. And my own nation, Estados Unidos, was born in a rebellion against standing armies. We Americans hated the idea because it was the British standing army ruling over us. So we rebelled against it. We ended up with the Second Amendment. Oh, that's a long story. We're not going to go down that path. But it has to do with our militia and guns in my country. The point is the standing army issue was a big, big deal in the 18th century, both pro and con. It was one of the most important questions. So in the middle of the century, what is it, 1756, I think, when maybe France is going to invade Britain, and everyone's panicking because there's not really quite a good standing army available. And there's a question, do you give your rulers so much power over the people? The American colonists hated it. I don't have to tell you what the Irish thought of this all, right? I mean, it wasn't their standing army that they got either. Scotland, you have opinions being very mixed. I'll get back to that. But Smith is coming down so clearly for the standing army. And he insists that it will boost liberty. Not just, well, we need to do it because someone will take us over. He thinks within the country it will boost liberty. And here's the sentence, or part of the sentence, that reminded me of the recent, very recent history of Colombia. Smith said that a quality standing army was good because if the standing army was strong, it gave the sovereign the ability to, quote, safely pardon or neglect political opponents, and his consciousness of his own superiority naturally disposes him to do so, end quote. Smith then says, if you don't have the standing army, you as a ruler, you feel so weak that you have to engage in perpetual surveillance over your enemies. You fight against them, you war against them. But if you feel secure in your rule of the country, you can pardon your enemies. I'm sure you all know better than I do the various amnesties to terrorists, whatever one would call them, in Colombia, 2016, 2017, other years, not always popular with the electorate, but there are periodic attempts to pardon what you might call the men with the guns. And the question has been, is the central government here strong enough to get away with such a pardon and still be able to rule the country? And Smith, publishing in 1776, he saw this as a central issue. So you read these pages about the standing army and you keep on thinking, FARC. If you look in the correspondence of Smith, he never mentions FARC, right? He was before the time of FARC, but he saw just how clearly that possibly the path to a relatively free country was not a government stripped of power, but a government secure enough that it can tolerate some degree of opposition. And in the long run, that government will protect people's rights, keep crime to a minimum, maintain order in the nation, and so on. So I think my first point just about Adam Smith is, yes, economics, but Adam Smith, to me, was writing about Colombia. And that's why you invited me, because maybe I'm the person who comes here and tells you that. So Smith made some other points about standing armies that also reminded me remarkably of Colombia. So for Smith, a big reason to have standing armies is that they give you a larger market size. So we know Smith believed in increasing returns, larger markets, greater division of labor, his whole story of progress and ongoing economic growth. Who is it that Smith cites approvingly in this passage? Not that nice a guy, it's Peter the Great. So Peter the Great in Russia, don't want to talk too much about Russia tonight either, but Peter the Great used the army to increase market size, make Russia a larger, greater nation. Morally, we may not feel entirely comfortable about this, either now or then, but it's striking to me that Smith is willing to use as his main example a ruler who was somewhat of a tyrant, albeit an ambitious tyrant, who built his nation. Now, if I think of the economic history of Colombia, one thing striking to me, just as an outsider, is how divided up the country is. So this is great if you're a tourist, because you can keep on going in different parts of the country and see, feel, experience, hear, the accents also, the foods, very different things. You go to the Caribbean, you go to Cali and so on, right? Different parts of Colombia, Amazon, are very different. In some parts of Colombia on the Pacific coast, I believe, I've never tried, but I believe to this day, you still cannot get there just driving a car on a normal road. Maybe some very powerful vehicle, cut through the jungle, but they're separated from the rest of the country, is my understanding. I hope to fly there sometime and see it, but I don't think I'll be driving. So you have this great diversity in Colombia. It makes it interesting and creative, very good for an outsider to visit. But in terms of market size, the market size of Colombia is not as large as it looks because the country never quite has been economically unified, culturally unified, brought under a single consistent rule of law. So Smith is saying it's a standing army that does that. It's a good thing when you can do it. And with Colombia, we have a nation still living out the Smithian conflict. Now, from what I observe, again, just speaking as an underinformed outsider, what I observe is the central government in Colombia, more or less, is winning this conflict with many hiccups, many bumps, some reversals. But if you look at the medium-term trends, the long-run trends, to me, they seem quite favorable, even though I think if you live here, you might think optimistic outsiders are somewhat naive because you experience various costs of the status quo on a regular basis. But for Smith's whole vision of a capitalist society based on division of labor, as I read the book, Wealth of Nations, as I read Book 5, it is underpinned by something very definitely military in nature. So the military and foreign policy and domestic policy with regard to terrorists, for Smith, are primary concepts. And I've gone my whole life, like since I was a kid, hearing people talk about Adam Smith and capitalism. Maybe that skewed my view, but it made me more and more interested in Smith as a theorist of conflict. I think there's another argument in Smith for a standing army. I know it's been discussed by specialists, but I don't see it get a lot of attention in the broader public understanding of Smith. And this has to do, again, with standing armies. So there's something quite special about even just having an army, and we see it in the history of my own country, and that is armies integrate. So if you ask, in which area of American life did racial integration progress the furthest, the most quickly? One of the leading candidates would be the armed forces. There were, of course, early on segregated units, but over time you had integration and opportunity come to the armed forces before many other parts of American life. When you have a standing army for Great Britain, what it means, this is a little invisible to us today, but it means that English people and Scottish people, and furthermore, Scottish urbanites and Scottish people from the Highlands, that they are going to work together, be together, fight together, speak the same language together. It's a very radical idea. It is a way of making a nation an actual nation, culturally of bringing everyone together. In a much less fortunate way, this was the case with the German armed forces, that for fighting World War II, many young Germans showed up speaking only dialect and went away understanding High German because they had to work and fight with other people. So there's something in Smith where he, I think, is very frequently suggesting that most external observers underrate the benefits from thinking big or having larger units. And the standing army endorsement is part of that for Smith. It's a way to get Great Britain to be truly Britain and truly great. Smith also favored union with Ireland. That went less well, but I think he doesn't say much about it, but in his vision, I think Smith was hoping Ireland would integrate in the same way that Scotland did with England. As I think you all know, it was Smith who wanted to take what is now the United States and have it be part of one nation with what we now call the United Kingdom, was formerly Great Britain, before the Act of Union was England. So Smith truly thought big in a way that was crazy, is one way to look at it. When you read Smith today, it doesn't sound crazy. His mood, his tone is that of an entirely sane man. But Smith actually thought you could take all these nations and that it would be a good thing to bunch them together, be a single economic, political, military unit. It would include North America, what we now call Canada, United States, United Kingdom, Ireland. It was an incredible vision. And I think so much of Smith, and I'm including theory of moral sentiments here, is Smith telling us to look larger, look for the bigger picture, see what more you can do than you think. And the biases in Smith, the perceptual biases, and again, you see this also in theory of moral sentiments, they are about people thinking too small. You worry too much about the scratch on your finger, not enough about, people dying in the flood in China and so on. So just how far Smith was willing to take this, to me, is radical, and the idea of the standing army is underpinning it. So one of the people Smith is responding to, I believe, I don't recall if he mentions him by name, but it was Andrew Fletcher of Saltoun, who's publishing in 1698 against the idea of standing armies. And it's striking back then the extent to which a lot of the opponents of standing armies, they favor a very conservative worldview. So Saltoun didn't even want, Scotland to unify with England, as happened in 1707. He was afraid society was becoming too commercial. He thought London was too big a city within England. You still hear that, by the way. Too much in London, Well, Fletcher said that back in the late 1690s. But he had a kind of anti-modernist perspective. So one of the things I, as a reader, find most intriguing in Smith is just how consistent a modernist he was. There's this thing, modern society, it can work, it can mostly be decentralized, it needs these strong military underpinnings, it needs defense, it needs markets. I'll get to education and religion in a moment, but they're part of the picture as well. And he understood that this was capable and indeed likely of being greater than the ancient world and of being greater than, say, medieval world ruled by the church. So just how far Smith sees into this, and that he is still seeing, he is so early seeing the dilemmas that are so common in Colombian history, that how do we make this a single market unit? How do we have economic unification? How are we bringing this nation together? And if you think about different guerrilla groups or FARC, they're a perversion of the idea of the militia as it was presented in the 17th and 18th centuries. But in fact, you can think of FARC as one possible equilibrium outcome if you allow militias. The militias don't just stay like a bunch of neighborhood guys who band together whenever the French might land in boats. If you don't have a standing army and the militias have the guns, try running that experiment. How well is that going to work? Well, some of the time it might work, but a lot of the time it's not going to work well. I grew up in New Jersey, like in mafia land. You ever see The Sopranos, the TV show? Like, that stuff is true. So you have mafioso having, a fair number of guns. In Mexico, you have drug gangs, on average, having more advanced weaponry than the Mexican government fighting them. And one of the equilibria you get from militias is the militias start to centralize and they become political powers unto themselves. And indeed, in Mexico, you see this most strongly. It is now estimated that about one quarter of the territory of Mexico is run not by the government, but by gangs. Militias is one way to put it. My own country, we have another weird equilibrium with militias. They don't centralize. If they centralized or tried to, the police, the army, Marines, whoever would, crush them. But you have this kind of decentralized, crazy system where a lot of nutty individuals run around with guns. They think of themselves as militias, setting right injustices, shooting people in terrible, awful ways, sometimes in schools. And that's the North American, not Canadian, but like US version of militia. So it's a weird set of issues. Getting right the standing army, it's a very archaic terminology, but in today's world, it is still of central importance. Which countries get right the standing army question? Not many of them get it very right. I'm not sure any of them do, actually. But again, you find the importance of this in Adam Smith. Now, let me talk for a bit about religion and education. They're also in Smith's Book 5. And they're some of the most important parts of Wealth of Nations, because Smith realized that societies do not sustain themselves automatically, but people need to have good enough morals. It's in this regard you can think of Malthus as actually very directly Smithian, when you see the moral side of Smith from the discussions on religion and also education. So Smith worries obviously about the division of labor, which is extremely powerful economically. But the division of labor, as we all know, for Smith and also for Marx, it enfeebles the individual. It makes people too narrow, bored, weak, uninteresting. Some would say alienated, right? That's the Marxian term that caught on. And Smith worries about this, that it will make us a society of dunces, all performing the repetitive operations over and over again. And if you just let people become dunces, first, you have dunces. That's like intrinsically bad. And second, that will not sustain the martial virtue you need to defend your society. So you can't only let the division of labor operate. This gets back to the point I made a few minutes ago, that the tendency of individuals, if left to themselves, is to see things too small and not look large enough. So Smith never says, well, you have this boring job in a factory and you turn the same screw for 30 years in a row, but don't worry, when you come home, you turn on public television, you read Dostoevsky, maybe you read Adam Smith, you go to a Beethoven concert. There's nothing like that in Smith. Smith's fear is that the individuals will just stay put in that equilibrium where they just focus on the small world around them and they don't see the larger picture. So that's a problem that for Smith is coming up again. And Smith says, well, the education system has the responsibility of remedying this, and also religion has that responsibility. And when it comes to education, what Smith wants, which again you'll find in Book 5, is he wants for the government to subsidize education in science and philosophy to make people smarter, not so different from how things have turned out. And he wants the government to subsidize public diversions. So for this, Smith says, I mean the arts, I mean music, I mean theater. So there's actually an argument for government support of the arts in Smith. I'm not myself entirely persuaded by it. I think Smith greatly underestimated how much information markets alone would throw in people's faces. But nonetheless, Smith has this notion that you need to improve the outputs you will get if you rely on division of labor alone. And education for Smith is one piece of that puzzle. And as you know, again in Book 5, Smith argues it should be paid for partly by the private sector, partly by the public sector, be done on a local basis, be competitive when possible, and not be too bureaucratic and not reliant on endowments. So Smith there also, he's putting forward a very radical view. Unlike with the standing armies, I don't think it's exactly what we have tried to follow, but the notion that the public sector has a role in kind of regulating the individual units that will comprise capitalist society, it's a remarkably 20th century notion when you look at the policy arena, not an idea that at least general readers typically associate with Adam Smith. I think the main argument in Smith is that actually this kind of decentralized process can work if you have some okay policy and you have large enough market size, ongoing division of labor. So Smith here is pretty optimistic. There's some kind of mixed economy where government does some things and that it can work, and again, give you something better than what antiquity had, and just a much nicer, healthier society than, say, medieval Europe ruled by the church. But the other thing Smith worries about is, in fact, religion. And I think it's on religion where his predictions are most off. But oddly, it brings us back again to my other idea for the evening, which is Colombia. So Smith, of course, is not crazy about the Catholic Church being established as a state church on much of the continent of Europe. He's not really a fan of the Anglican Church at all. He didn't like the education he got in England, backed by an endowment and with religious requirements and restrictions and so on. So Smith, in this regard, is quite a Scot. as I read him, he's relatively sympathetic toward Presbyterianism, though I don't think he believed in it as a doctrine. But Smith was asking himself, well, how exactly should religion be arranged or organized or allowed to evolve so that this wonderful, very modernistic society can proceed? Didn't want a very powerful state church. His vision, as I read book 5, is that you're going to have all these people from the countryside migrate to the cities. By the way, Bogota, to me, looks to have about 10 million people. Is that like approximately right? A lot of them came from the countryside. And you see in emerging economies this great risk that people migrate from the countryside to the city. They lose touch with traditional norms. They don't quite have anything to replace it. The extended family is gone. Durkheim referred to anomie as the state of not feeling that you belong and being upset and alienated and disconnected. All of these have been actual problems. And it's to Smith's credit that he saw those problems very clearly in the 18th century, as I read him. And he saw them simply because he lived in Scotland and at times London, and saw people from the countryside migrating to the larger cities, and it didn't go entirely well. They had rotten lives often. They were unhappy. They would get too drunk, whatever. So Smith draws this distinction between like the liberal religions and the austere religions, and what he wants, as I understand his words, is for the people who migrate to the cities to become attached to small religious sects and kind of become too religious from Smith's point of view, like more religious than, correct doctrine would indicate, but that these small sects would perform the very useful function of giving people something to do, giving them a community, giving them a worldview, helping them out when they're in need, and so on and so on and so on. So again, it's a very compelling vision, and how well it is operated depends on the country in question. But I don't think mostly that is what we have seen. So Smith's vision that you might have like 200 small sects, maybe as was starting to emerge in 17th century England, it wasn't really how things ended up going. More people than I think Smith ever had imagined simply ended up not being religious at all. They didn't become Quakers or Puritans. They're just, secular lives in the cities, and in fact, somewhat alienated. I think the decline of religion is a significant problem in many societies, including my own. But if you look at Colombia, I went to the Wikipedia page. I just thought I would look up numbers. These are probably not entirely accurate, but I don't think they can be too far off. So in Colombia as a nation, here's the religious allegiances as given by Wikipedia. First, 70% Catholic. How many of those are actually Catholic? A lot of you live here. I don't know. But obviously Colombia is a Catholic country in some way. In 1991, is that the year you have the new constitution? The church is disestablished. It's not the official church. I'm not sure if that was the important event or people don't go as much as they used to. A friend of mine told me that now Colombia recently passed a law allowing abortion up to 6 months. And whatever you think of that law, it's not like entirely Catholic, right, by global standards. So Colombia is 70% nominally Catholic. However truly Catholic it is, I don't know. As an outsider, I don't know. But I'm pretty sure it's much less than that. And now if we look at, the sects, well, there's 14% evangelical in Colombia. That's pretty high. And in a lot of Latin countries, the actual adherence to being evangelical is higher than the number sounds, because a lot of people in that number really believe it, really practice it, are very active. So maybe that's like, in many countries, it would be a big 14%. But after that, it really drops off. You have 1.6% Pentecostal, which in some ways is an offshoot of evangelical. There's a small number of Mormons, small number of Jehovah's Witnesses. This one surprised me. The high, 70,000 in Colombia, quite a few. But they don't seem powerful as a small sect in the way that Smith envisioned or hoped for. So it seems to me that there, what Smith wanted, the kind of dual blades. On one hand, you have subsidized science and entertainment, elevating people. On the other hand, you have these small religious sects bringing the alienated migrants in the big cities into community. And that part of it just hasn't quite gone as well as I might have hoped, at least in most of the world's nations. It seems to me major cities in my country, in Colombia, in most countries, try Brazil, right, have really major social problems. Religion continues to decline. The small sects, maybe they're stepping into the void for Mormons, some other groups, but it's not that high a percentage of the population that is getting the benefits of the small sects. So these numbers on Colombia, if I take them literally, it's still way below 20% who are belonging to, Smith's small sects. And then you have the previously established state religion, Catholicism, big nominal numbers, adherence, loyalty, attendance, dedication, up for question and debate. And you just have a less healthy and happy society than I think Smith was expecting. So in this regard, his defense of modernity, he was, in my view, remarkably correct about standing armies and their importance, but somewhat off and a bit too optimistic on religion and education. And we have today different forms of public subsidy for science and philosophy. You might think that's entirely a good thing, but I'm not sure how effective they are. So we had in the United States a government get out there and tell everyone to get vaccinated. That's science. What percentage of my country got vaccinated? I think it's about 70%. What percent got a booster, which turned out to be important? I forget the number, but it's a lot lower than 70%. Again, I checked Wikipedia. They claim in Colombia, 2 shots is about 70%. So roughly the same as in the United States. Boosters is always going to be a much lower number. I saw some data recently in the United States. If you got your 3rd booster, which most people didn't, but say you got number 3, what was the chance you would get number 4? It was 1 in 10. For the United States, which at least in some ways is sort of kind of the most advanced scientific nation in the world, maybe not in the general population, but at some level of the elites. And you have of the people who knew enough to get the 3rd dose, only 10% getting the 4th dose. And now the CDC is trying to tell everyone to get the 4th dose. It's hard to be entirely optimistic about, how those subsidies to science and philosophy are going. And the subsidies to philosophy, I'm still kind of looking to find those. They seem to lose college majors every year. And it's just like a dwindling thing in the United States and a lot of other places. Philosophy is just far less important. One of the big macro things going on in Wealth of Nations, I think, is that Smith is arguing you shouldn't base a republic on philosophy very much at all. So Plato's Republic, which in many ways I read Smith's Wealth of Nations as a response to at the macro level, Plato's Republic, as presented by Socrates, you have the philosopher kings who make all the decisions. They're very wise. They tell everyone what to do. And Smith is opting for decentralization, arguing mostly correctly that's a much better system. And he's letting philosophy in the door a bit, nothing's run by philosophy, but we'll let the government subsidize it a bit to offset division of labor and its alienating effects. And so people are a bit more philosophical. Again, you might think that's a fine thing to do, but how effective it has been in making people a bit more philosophical, I guess I am somewhat skeptical. So if we're just kind of stepping back and asking, what is it that Smith got right or didn't get right about human nature, at least from the vantage point of 2022, thinking about Colombia and also the United States, I think the extent to which individuals would simply detach from some mix of learning, religion, community, and just be detached and a bit alienated and stay that way, it seems to me the implied description of human nature you read in Wealth of Nations in Book 5 is not what has ended up happening. That perhaps there was something special about Smith's time, maybe starting in the 17th century, where people are especially ideological and involved and engaged, at least in Great Britain, and very religious, and you have many sects. You have the Enlightenment arising. You can think of that as another sect of sorts. You have what becomes the American Revolution, yet another sect, mostly run by young men, in fact, in their 20s. And everyone gets very excited about that. So there's some kind of excitability about that era, and passion and involvement. And this is me speculating, but it seems to me Smith took that as a kind of base. But that may be somewhat of a historical outlier. Not that it's never happened before, but that it's not the norm. And Smith is treating it as the norm and thinking, well, we just need to channel that passion into the small religious sects for the alienated rural people who move into the big cities. But the alternative that they would just detach, that's 2022, the way I see it. So, like, which is more common in world history? How things are in 2022, or like how they started to be in 17th and then 18th century Great Britain? I'm not sure. I suppose looking forward, I expect more 2022, but I think there are some parts of the world, maybe parts of the world where, say, you've had Islamic revolutions, or people might feel a bit more in tune with this earlier notion that there will be these very intense feelings and engagements, and the question will be how to channel them rather than how to deal with so many people detaching. So, I've been trying to give you just a different picture of Adam Smith. I'm not a historian of thought by any means, but I've read Wealth of Nations now really quite a few times. First time I read it, I think I was 14. It had a big impact on me. It helped me decide I wanted to be an economist. And all the discussion, of pricing and the grain trade, division of labor, that's really where I learned those things. So most economists today, they learn what they know in graduate school, undergraduate school, and then maybe, if you're lucky, you can coerce them or persuade them to read a bit of Adam Smith, and you hope they will continue. But it's never sort of what's bred in the bone, not what they grew up with. But these ideas I actually learned first from Adam Smith. So I think in that sense, I consider myself a true Smithian, even if I don't agree with it all. And the Smithian vision to me, it just seemed so compelling. The notion that you could have growth and it would make people's lives better, and that at least if you did a bunch of things the right way rather than the wrong way, that the system would be self-sustaining and self-improving. And if you ask, to this day, who is the best theorist of that idea, who had the deepest ideas, the notion still most worth thinking about, talking about, debating, it seems to me that was Adam Smith. So it's really a remarkably impressive book by one of humanity's, not the great economists, but really greatest thinkers of all time. More and more, I don't read Smith as an economist. I read him as a theorist of society, in the same way that Adam Ferguson was a theorist of society. There's plenty more we could talk about, but I think maybe I'll open it up for questions. There's some other ideas I've been kicking around about, how does Smith's argument for the Navigation Acts apply today? What was the stance of the Irish Enlightenment on these same questions, as opposed to the Scottish Enlightenment? Bunch of other things, but why don't I stop now, leave about 20 minutes for questions. Please feel free to ask anything you want, and thank you all for coming and listening. Questions? Yes? Wait.
Who is having the question? No, nobody. Questions, everyone?
What do you think, by the way, Professor Cowen, thank you for coming and thank you for addressing Colombia. And my question is, what do you think Smith would have thought of Gran Colombia and Simón Bolívar's original vision? And why did that fall apart, you think?
Oh, that's a big and difficult question. What would Smith have thought of Simón Bolívar's vision, and why did it fall apart? If you read Smith on the Anglo world, I think the natural conclusion is he would have favored larger political units for Latin America. This at times had been planned for Central America also, and as you indicate and all know, it never happened. I don't think that ever would have been possible. So I think there's something different about the Anglo world and South America in particular. Never quite sure what it is, but I mean, here's a few things I would cite. North America, which has become by far the biggest part of the Anglo world, has a remarkable number of navigable rivers, which are easier to deal with than the Amazon, and really a lot of flat territory. Like, you ever drive across Ontario, Kansas, Iowa? My God, it's awful. It's like boring, but boring is good in this context. It can sustain your larger political unit. So to tie together United States, North America, I'm not going to say it was easy, but crossing the Rockies was terrible. But a lot of parts of the country, sort of economically speaking, geographically speaking, geopolitically speaking, fit together actually pretty well. Canada also. And England is never very vertical, and they just spent many centuries working on building their nation state. So if you think about like Norman invasion as a sort of turning point, makes England become, over time less Viking, less purely Anglo, more mixed. But that's like starting some version of nation state building in England in 1066. And that's not really complete until, I don't know, you read Thomas Hardy and local customs still seem so strong. That's well into the 19th century. I would say kind of railways in the 19th century more or less finish that nation building exercise. So it's basically taking 800-900 years. Then you look at South America. So you have, say, the Incan Empire, which spent a long time trying to build up a cohesive political unit with some breadth and had some success. But for the most part, you have outsiders coming in, wiping out the earlier political units and starting from scratch. So if the English, the most successful people, maybe along with the Danes or with Japan at nation building, if the English needed 800 to 900 years, well, how is it going to go in the New World? And then without all those nice rivers, which help North America, but not so much South America. And like even today, I've traveled to really a lot of South America. Last trip I did was to Argentinian Patagonia. Just getting around, like to get to the place I wanted to go, it can take days. And that's with, current technology. And you're like, oh, well, some guy is going to come in a vehicle because you need this vehicle so he can drive you through the river. And you're like, okay, like I'm willing to do this because otherwise I have to go home. But you don't feel that great about it. It usually turns out fine. So without that much nation building and increasing the market scope and size, I don't think Bolivar's dream here could have worked. Like it hasn't, it's clearly failed in Venezuela, flat out. Colombia, it's a work in progress, which I think eventually will succeed, but it's been this awful, violent path to get there. Brazil, it's not even clear to me it will work. Brazil is getting more violent, crazier politically in some ways. Peru, for whatever reasons, I couldn't tell you, but you read in the news, it just seems to be collapsing. Ecuador doing better than Peru, but not impressive. You would say Uruguay, total success. Panama, more or less total success. Chile was looking quite successful, but now that's a bit of doubt with all the political turmoil, but you still, I think, could say Chile was a nation-building success. And why is that? Look at the map. There's water. It's not a river, but you can take the water from one part of Chile to another if you need to, so you can connect it. And you go to different parts of Chile, like they do feel different, but not the way different parts of Brazil do at all. So you could say Chile, successful but in doubt, Uruguay, successful, Panama, successful. The others still works in progress. And so to think that something much bigger could have been done, I don't think it could have been. I think we're lucky, we got what we did. But Central America, that's a bit different. But, Panama, again, being separate. Panama, of course, is part of Colombia, historically. Part of Colombia's problem is that its potentially most effective city was taken from it. My apologies for all of my country in that. But Panama is much wealthier than any part of Colombia. And you can imagine a world where that's still part of Colombia, like someone builds a canal there at some point in time, and it becomes some kind of gateway for Colombia being a much more important exporting power and developing the whole Caribbean region in a very different and much wealthier way. That's some kind of weird alternate history. The smaller nations like Nicaragua, Honduras, Costa Rica, El Salvador, you go to them, they feel very different. They're not, you can't smush them together and make them into one nation now. I don't know what the counterfactual is like where you ever could have done that. But it seems to me they're so small, like that counterfactual has to be somewhere. Maybe it's like in 1824, but like they never could have been one bigger nation. Seems unlikely to me. Yes.
Thank you for the talk. And I would like to emphasize something which I found in your talk a little bit paradoxical or even contradictory. You choose two things in Smith that seems to portray a vision of a society, which is the first one, the standing army, is the notion of a homogenization of the society in a certain way. Because the main element of this was the unification of a market. You think, okay, it's maybe only not a homogenization of the culture of the country, but the homogenization of the territorial integration or something like this, or the rule of the state in a whole territory. But the other part of Smith you emphasized which is this idea of the sects, of the multicultural in a certain way, of the presence of multiple forms of life, multiple and in a certain way different fellow feelings which religion or a sect can create. It seems to be going in the direction of a heterogeneous, culturally heterogeneous, multicultural nation. And this is paradoxical, but my reading of your conclusion going in the direction of the first was okay, and we have a good result with this. And the second one was not. Seems to be attention of the not only of Smith, but the construction of a country like Colombia, which is okay. Let's imagine we have a unified rule of law in Colombia. Would Adam Smith imply that this means the destruction of multiculturalism or not? That's only my struggling with this paradoxical choice of
That's a very interesting point. Thank you. I think there's a paradox in the world for sure, but I'm not sure there's a paradox in Smith. I don't think Smith is very multicultural. So his idea of diversity to me is like you have 160 different crazy British sects. The lies they tell to each other are like nominally different, but they're all just like crazy poor British people being held in check. And how he thought about Ireland, as I read him, doesn't ever say it explicitly, but I get the feeling, well, he thinks with time they can become British enough. And I mean, they did, you could say, in a way. They don't speak much Irish anymore. They speak English. Being in Ireland, it's very different from being in England, but in the broad scheme of things, it's not really that different. And when Smith, say, gets truly multicultural and talks about India, which he covers quite a bit, I never see a realization that someday Indians are coming. You look at the current list of like favorite candidates for prime minister, like half of them are South Asian and one of them's Nigerian ethnically. I think that would have shocked Smith. So it's all about, well, you want someone to open up trade with India, but you want that trade to become competitive over time. They have things we want, we have things they want, like that's fine. But migrations of peoples, he clearly was seeing, say, to North America, but I don't think he ever internalized what that was going to mean, pursued more consistently, which would be these multicultural societies, United States, Canada, Colombia, in a very different way. Migration here now seems to me pretty low, just walking in the street. There's Venezuelans who are like pretty close cousins. There's like some batch of Lebanese. There's some like lame attempts at Chinese restaurants that aren't like even Chinese food. And Brazil's another country, had very high migration early on, seems to have dwindled. You get some Andeans like crossing into some of the wealthier countries for jobs. So I think not understanding the dilemmas of multiculturalism, it's a real weakness in the Scottish Enlightenment. Hume, of course, has his own take on it. But that's very controversial because he said some things, you're not supposed to talk about anymore. Yes?
That's okay if you want to project.
Oh, that's sure. I'm sorry, didn't see you.
So I'd be interested in hearing you expand on your concerns about the decline, as you see it, of religion in the United States. And I'm thinking about a few things here. One is, it seems to me we have a religious mindset in the United States that is spilling over into things like the way we view our Constitution, right? It's a sacred document to us, the Second Amendment, right? It's as if since the time that slaveholders first formed the United States, let's say, we haven't learned anything. And that's just surprising. I think, so I see a potential decline in religion as maybe changing our thinking in some broad ways. You mentioned Uruguay as an example of a thriving country here. And I think Uruguay, and people can correct me here if I'm wrong, but I think Uruguay has an interesting system where when you survey people broadly across South America and you say, what's a percentage of people in this country that are religious? Let's say it's 80% religious, 20% who are part of the nuns, right? Non-religious, they're not affiliated with the church, mosque, or synagogue. In Uruguay, I think it's the opposite. Like 80% of people say that they are not affiliated with a church, mosque, or synagogue. And I've heard the reason for that, and I'm curious if you know if this is accurate, but the reason is they have a great social safety net. And so I don't share your concern about the decline, and so I'm curious to know what you're thinking about there, and I'll leave my questions at that. Thank you.
I think small nations, when community is strong, which includes Uruguay, but not only, Denmark, many others, they can become quite non-religious and just do fine. They still have community. United States is huge. We're the only large nation that is even tolerably well run. But what I observe are rising rates of depression, which is documented numerically, people breaking away from communities and doing very bad, crazy things. School shootings, a visible example, but not by any means the only example. And I think as Americans, we're people who left behind the past, left behind our parents. We're somewhat crazy anyway. We're thrown into a cauldron where we're encouraged to be crazier and innovative. And I think to be religious within an established religion is for many people the better outcome. And there's some even empirical work on this. The people in religions in the US seem to be more involved and happier and have better lives. And they're going to believe in something. And I'm not myself religious, I'm not myself Christian, but I'd much rather have them believe in Christianity than where they seem to be ending up, traversing that space on their own, which is a lot of bad right-wing views, a lot of bad left-wing views. I really miss Christianity as a more active force in the American body politic. And for all the criticism it received in, say, the 1980s, to me that seemed much healthier than what we had now. There's work on this, in fact. Someone wrote a piece about it, and on average, they tend to be people who have left religions and are looking for a new thing. And that's exactly my worry. American Protestantism is relatively safe, and it has some very positive features, like encouraging people to think about their lives in terms of projects and charity. And it's focal historically, and even American Catholicism is really a branch of American Protestantism. So the decline of that, to me, is an issue. But I definitely agree, for smaller countries, you can do the Denmark thing in many cases, and it will be just fine.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on a question. I just want some clarity on, I understand that Smith, now given the context and the particular focus of the countries and cultures he's discussing, you said that he's not very useful in terms of negotiating the dilemmas of multicultural societies and handling heterogeneity in that sense. But I was very surprised by that, because I think that there is a theme in the literature, especially Fauna Foreman, on talking about Smith actually kind of building out this more cosmopolitan understanding of morality. I think he seems to be, when he talks about the slave trade, it seems to be that he acknowledges that these vast material differences in power is what causes this type of conflict. And he doesn't go into these kind of theories of superiority that some other thinkers at the time might have about different cultures. When he talks in Theory of Moral Sentiments about the influence of fashion, he talks about different practices for shaping the body in different communities, including non-Western communities, and he criticizes Christian missionaries for suggesting that these non-Western communities that this is a sign of their stupidity when European women use corsets in a very similar way. So I guess I just wanted to push back and just have you clarify, is it more that Smith doesn't have an appreciation for just how hard it is to figure out a community that has these different values and ways of looking at the world within the community? Or is it that his approach in trying to transcend certain particular judgments is itself maybe a misleading principle for us? I'm just trying to understand what precisely you mean about sort of why he's lacking in terms of these questions on multiculturalism.
I don't think Smith could sufficiently well see why multiculturalism could work. So as I read him, he thought about these issues quite deeply, and his base case was the absorption of Highlands barbarians into the cities of Scotland and also England, maybe other places as well, America in time. And he saw that was happening. I think he saw it was working, but it was a tough mountain to climb. And that's a relatively modest absorption. I worry that in Theory of Moral Sentiments, there are micro foundations for the Robert Putnam view that when people are a bit different from each other, levels of trust and sympathy are lower. Now, I'm more optimistic about multiculturalism than that, but I do recognize the dilemma. So I wonder if Smith would not have come out with Putnam and thinking, well, like, we can let the Highlanders, walk down to Glasgow, but you can't go too much beyond that. And even Smith's, while he's very good on slavery, if you read him on India, he's entirely fine with the notion that the East India Company be paid this bounty to begin with to settle India. He doesn't quite have a sense of I don't know if I'd call it sovereignty, but like that it's not quite their business. So I don't know, I think Smith might have problems with those issues, at least relative to my point of view.
So there is one question? One last question? Okay.
Thank you. I was wondering while you were giving the talk, it got me thinking how for many countries in Europe with the Ukraine war, it's been such sort of a shift in military expenditure, right? So it's been sort of going the contrary tendency. I was wondering if you don't think that we should be mobilizing different types of agencies to confront conflict rather than going back to what we've been doing, which has been very, very high levels of military expenditure, which is also the case in Colombia. Actually, I think in Latin America, we have very high levels of military expenditure. So especially when we have one unifying factor at this point, which is climate change, which should be something that is in balance with all our interests. Basically, the question is, shouldn't we be focusing on a different scope of what we've been doing, basically?
Obviously, that gets a bit into politics. Just to close, I'll tell you what I think. I think Western Europe is in denial when it comes to Adam Smith and standing armies. Many of those countries don't have effective standing armies at all for any purposes. Poland understands what the actual deal is about. Ukraine obviously understands. A lot of Western Europe has decided to play a trading game where they rely on the American military and sort of trade us other favors, but when the time comes, they don't always want to pay up the other favors, that they take it for granted. Donald Trump pointed that out. Sort of, elite intellectuals hated to hear it because it was Donald Trump pointing it out, but I think basically he was correct. And the solution up until now, it has mostly worked, but it's really at the point of not working well anymore. And when you have the leading funder of Putin's Russia being Germany, which also has no military of its own and relies on America to both defend them and to tolerate the fact that they're the leading funder of Putin's Russia, again, I just don't think it's stable for much longer. And Adam Smith will turn out to be right once again. But anyway, thank you all for the questions. I will give them.
I have one more question.
Oh, yeah, okay, sure.
Hi.
That's fine,
So,
yeah.
based on what you said about individuals not taking into account the bigger picture, the success of an economy doesn't matter if it's a state, a nation, or a global economy, is human cooperation. Here goes the question. How could the economy enhance and encourage human cooperation? Or do you think the problem of human cooperation should be resolved with a different perspective, such as religion? And finally, do you think there was more human cooperation in the Adam Smith era in the 17th century?
There is a sound problem. You speak clearly, but the microphone, it distorts what you're saying. Could someone repeat the question?
Is this okay?
I'll try it.
Okay. So, based on what you said about the individuals not taking into account the bigger picture, I think it's appropriate to say that the success of an economy doesn't matter if it's in a state, a nation, or the global economy, is human cooperation. How could the economy enhance and encourage human cooperation? Or do you think the problem of human cooperation should be resolved with a different perspective, such as religion? I also think this is related in a way, because I think it's like a fast conclusion, but I think in the 17th century, there was more human cooperation. There was like less individual way of thinking, less liberal. So yes, that's my question.
Yeah, I suppose in my view of the world, like part of me buys into Steven Pinker. People get a bit better over time with progress and wealth. I think he exaggerates how much better. They get a little better. And then another part of me thinks Well, it's hard to get people to be much more cosmopolitan. The thing we've actually done is turn cosmopolitanism into a sect and market it to our liberal intellectual elites. That exists as its own sect. But most people aren't that cosmopolitan, and probably that will never change. And we have to live with that. And I think that is broadly consistent with how Smith saw the matter and how the 17th century French moralists saw the matter. That you only can push on people's better instincts so far. And often you do best getting them to be altruistic by appealing to their selfishness. But still, over time, it does seem to me in wealthier countries, people beat their children less. They beat their husbands and wives less. That's a form of progress, and it will continue morally to some degree, but pretty slowly.
So thank you very much for your talk. It's been very provocative, and I suppose we'll keep on the conversation, hopefully. Muchas gracias a todas las personas que asistieron y nos acompañaron en esta conferencia, tanto aquí en el auditorio como en línea. Muchas gracias a todos por haber estado acá y por favor agradezcámosle al profesor Cowen por su conferencia. Gracias.
Thank you.
Gracias.